Ethan had always been a busy man. Between his job as a tech developer and his side hustle creating digital art for various gaming companies, he barely had time to breathe, let alone tidy up his cluttered apartment. That's why he had signed up for the intergalactic cleaning service, Cosmic Maids. The agency sent their workers across the galaxy, offering alien cleaning professionals to meet the needs of any human in need of help. Ethan had been a loyal customer for over a year, always requesting a particular maid, Zora. Zora was an alien from a planet called Sycle, a species known for their meticulous nature and deep empathy. Her long blue skin, violet eyes, and graceful movements made her seem more like an otherworldly art piece than a cleaning professional. Ethan had quickly grown fond of her, enjoying their light-hearted conversations as much as he appreciated the sparkling, clean apartment she left behind. Zora was always kind, respectful, and understood his odd hours. She never judged his messy lifestyle, and somehow seemed to always know just how much cleaning he needed. But today was different. Ethan had placed his usual request for a cleaning, hoping for a nice, quiet afternoon to focus on some work. He was deep in code, his fingers tapping away on the keyboard, when the doorbell rang. It was early, but he figured Zora must have adjusted her schedule to fit his urgent need. He opened the door to find Zora standing there, looking slightly different from usual. Her pale blue skin was glowing a bit more intensely, her eyes unusually wide, and there was a strange air about her. Ethan, feeling slightly distracted by his workload, greeted her with a tired smile. "Hey, Zora. Good to see you again," he said, stepping aside so she could enter. Zora's eyes flared for a brief moment, and she nodded, but her movements were far less fluid than usual. She seemed tense. "Ethan," she said, her voice sounding almost strained, "I must inform you that my Sycle is upon me." Ethan blinked, not quite understanding. "Sycle? What do you mean?" Zora hesitated, then slowly took a step inside. "It's mating Sycle. I'm at a stage of biological urgency. It's not uncommon for my species, but it does affect my behavior. I will still clean, but it will be difficult to control my instincts." Ethan froze, the weight of her words sinking in. His mind raced, trying to process what she had just said. He knew that different alien species had unique biological needs, but mating cycles? This was beyond his expectations. You're still going to clean, right?" Ethan asked, his voice a bit shaky. He had never been in a situation like this before. His mind kept flashing back to all the times Zora had been so professional. And now, the tension in the room was palpable, and Ethan wasn't sure how to navigate this unexpected shift. Zora seemed almost embarrassed, her body tense as she stepped past him, her gaze momentarily darting to the floor. "I will try, but I cannot guarantee full control." Her voice was lower now, more animalistic in tone. Ethan didn't know what to do. He had requested her services for so long, and he didn't want to send her away, especially not when she was dealing with something so personal. But at the same time, he wasn't sure how to deal with the situation. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Zora," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't know about your Sycle." Zora gave him a small, apologetic smile. "It's not something I often talk about with clients," she admitted. "I understand if you want to reschedule, but I cannot leave. The service is already paid for, and I must fulfill my duties." Ethan nodded, but his mind was whirling. He could sense the urgency in her voice, and he wasn't sure what to do next. Was it wrong to let her clean while she was in this condition? Would it make things worse if he insisted on continuing with her service? As he stood there, debating with himself, Zora began to walk toward the living room, her movements more erratic than usual. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the cleaning supplies, but her gaze never left him. Ethan knew that he had to make a decision, but the gravity of the situation was overwhelming. Should he risk letting her continue the cleaning, or should he try to end the session? And, most importantly, what would happen next if he chose to let her finish? Ethan stood frozen in place, watching Zora struggle with her usual efficiency. His mind raced, tore between his need for the cleaning and his unease about the situation. Zora had always been professional, reliable, even comforting. Yet now, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Her glowing blue skin seemed brighter than before, as if it was responding to an energy he couldn't understand. She was still trying to gather the cleaning supplies, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. It was as though her body was at war with her mind, unable to focus on anything other than the biological drive that was now consuming her. Ethan could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, charged with a strange mix of emotions. I don't know if this is a good idea, he muttered, almost to himself. You're not acting like yourself. Zora paused, her hand still hovering over the cleaning cloth, her violet eyes meeting his with a mixture of frustration and sorrow. I cannot help it, Ethan. It is part of my species' biology. The cycle compels us to act on instincts. It is difficult to control, especially around humans. She hesitated again, her voice a little softer now. I do not want to make you uncomfortable. Ethan's heart clenched at the sight of her struggle. He could see that Zora was distressed, fighting against something much bigger than herself. She wasn't the calm, collected professional he had known, but a creature caught in the grip of primal urges. Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to stop everything, to send her away and let her return to her cycle in peace. But another part of him, well, he didn't want to lose the opportunity for the cleaning. It was silly, he knew, but something inside him was resistant to the idea of sending her away. He didn't want to be the one who dismissed her in her time of need. He started, but the words caught in his throat. I don't want you to feel like you have to clean if it's too much for you. Zora's expression softened, and she took a step closer to him. I am here to serve, Ethan. I understand if you find it awkward, but I will do my best to keep myself under control. I just ask for your understanding for this moment. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to process the situation. He wasn't a scientist, and his knowledge of alien biology was limited. This felt like a delicate balance. He didn't want to make Zora feel ashamed or uncomfortable, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the tension that was building between them. The longer she stayed, the more he felt a strange pull toward her, something far deeper than mere attraction. It felt wrong to ignore it. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If you think you can manage, then let's just finish this cleaning. I'll stay out of your way. Zora nodded, though the look in her eyes was filled with vulnerability that was hard to miss. Thank you for your patience, Ethan. She returned to the cleaning supplies, though her movements were still shaky, as though she was fighting a war inside herself. Ethan could sense the struggle within her, her focus wavering between the task at hand and the powerful instincts of her cycle. Ethan couldn't help but notice how close she was now, her delicate fingers brushing against the edges of his furniture as she worked. Every now and then, she would glance at him, her eyes reflecting a strange mix of desire and apology. It was like she was fighting an invisible force, one that she had no control over. Zora moved quickly, almost too quickly, wiping down surfaces and dusting with a frantic energy. Ethan noticed how her breath was shallow, her lips parted slightly, as if she was desperately trying to keep herself under control. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just a cleaning anymore. It was something far more complex, something far more dangerous than he had bargained for. Are you sure you're okay? Ethan asked, his voice filled with concern. You don't have to do this if you're not ready. Zora paused for a moment, her back still turned to him as she continued her cleaning. Her body stiffened, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might collapse. But then she took a slow, deep breath and steadied herself. I am fine, Ethan. I must finish for both of us. Her words hung in the air like a promise, but there was something unsettling about them. It was as though Zora was trying to convince herself more than him. Ethan's gaze followed her as she moved around the apartment, unable to shake the sense that he had just made a decision he wasn't sure he could take back. For the first time, he truly saw the divide between them. She was an alien, gorgeous, intelligent, kind, but right now, she was in control of herself. She was a creature driven by instincts he couldn't understand, and he couldn't help but wonder if this cleaning session would lead to something neither of them could handle. The tension in the air was thick, and every moment that passed seemed to stretch out endlessly. Ethan found himself trapped between a desire to help her and the growing fear that, by allowing her to stay, he might be walking into a situation that neither of them was prepared for. Would this decision change everything between them? The apartment felt quieter now, the sound of Zora's cleaning activities almost drowned out by the subtle hum of tension in the air. Ethan could feel the weight of every breath, the heavy silence that stretched between them, broken only by the soft scraping of her cleaning supplies on the floor. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The unease in his chest grew stronger with every passing minute. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake by letting her continue, but at the same time, something about Zora's struggle, the vulnerability in her eyes, pulled at him, kept him rooted to the spot. Zora was still moving quickly, almost too quickly, as though she wanted to finish before her instincts took over completely. Her hand shook slightly as she dusted the corners of the room, and every now and then she would pause, her breath shallow and uneven. The intensity in her eyes seemed to increase with each moment, as though she was battling something deep inside herself. Ethan couldn't help but watch her, tore between his concern for her well-being and the increasing sense of attraction that was bubbling beneath the surface. It was strange, unsettling. He knew he should feel uncomfortable, but somehow he didn't. There was an undeniable pull he couldn't explain, something raw and primal that seemed to mirror the urgency in her actions. "Zora," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he took a step toward her. "Are you sure you're okay? I don't want to push you too hard." Zora stopped abruptly, her violet eyes snapping up to meet his, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw something flicker behind her gaze, something darker, more intense. She seemed to hesitate, her body tense, before she spoke in a low, almost guttural voice. "I am managing, Ethan," she said, though her words lacked the usual confidence. She turned away quickly, resuming her task with a renewed sense of urgency. "I will finish this. I have to." Ethan swallowed hard. He could tell she was lying. There was no way she was fine. He could see it in her face, in the way her body trembled as she worked. But what was he supposed to do? He couldn't stop her, not when she was so determined, not when she was so clearly struggling to maintain control. It felt wrong, but he didn't know how to make it right. It was like watching someone fight a battle they couldn't win. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, more charged, as Zora continued her cleaning. Ethan found himself inching closer to her, his eyes locked on her every movement. Her skin was practically glowing now, the light reflecting off her in a way that was almost mesmerizing. It was hard to look away, but every time he did, he felt like he was betraying her, like he was pushing her deeper into something she didn't want. Finally, Zora paused again, her back stiff as she stood frozen in place. Ethan could see her breath coming in shallow gasps, her chest rising and falling with each desperate inhale. She turned to him, her face flushed, eyes wide and filled with a mixture of frustration and longing. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Before she could finish her sentence, there was a sudden shift in the air. Zora's entire body went rigid, her breathing erratic as her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that almost made Ethan freeze. He could feel the energy between them crackling, pulling him toward her as if some invisible force was urging him to cross a line he hadn't even realized existed. Zora," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know this would happen." But she wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes had darkened, the usual softness replaced with something more primal. Ethan could see it now. Her instincts had fully taken over. Zora was no longer the calm, collected maid he had known. She was a creature in heat, driven by a biological need she could not escape. Without warning, Zora stepped toward him, her movements fluid and purposeful. Ethan took a step back, but his legs felt weak. He wasn't sure if he should stop her or give in to whatever was happening between them. The air was thick with anticipation, his pulse racing as Zora's presence seemed to fill the entire room. Her hands reached out, and Ethan could feel the electricity in the air, the magnetic pull between them. "Please," Zora whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I cannot control it anymore. I need you, Ethan." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stood there, unsure of what to do. This wasn't just a simple cleaning session anymore. This wasn't about the mess in his apartment or even the service she had come to provide. This was something else entirely. Something deep, primal, and beyond anything he had expected when he made that call for help. He wanted to stop, wanted to tell her to leave, to get out of his apartment before this escalated any further. but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't move. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and every instinct his body screamed to give in, to stop pretending like nothing was happening, to just let go. But deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't just about desire. This was something more dangerous, something that could change everything between them, something that could never be undone. The room was spinning, and all he could do was wait, trapped between the pull of his own instincts and the knowledge that what they were about to do might not just be the result of biology. It might be the beginning of something far more complicated than he could ever imagine. The moment hung between them like a fragile thread, poised to snap at any second. Ethan's body was frozen, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. His mind screamed at him to stop, to push her away, to remember that this was wrong. But his body, his heart, they betrayed him. He couldn't look away from her, couldn't break the connection that was growing stronger with each passing second. Zora's eyes never left his, her breath shallow and quick, her body inching closer with each step. She was so beautiful. Her skin glowed with an almost otherworldly light, her movements impossibly graceful despite the overwhelming urge she was trying to control. But there was something more now, something deeper than attraction, or even the instincts that had taken over her. Ethan could see it in her eyes, the same desperation that mirrored his own. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just an alien species driven by biology. She was being trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape, fighting against something far stronger than herself. Ethan, Zora breathed, her voice low and hoarse. The word was more of a plea than anything else, as though she was searching for something from him. Permission, maybe, or forgiveness. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan could feel the tension between them crackling in the air, like static before a thunderstorm. His heart pounded in his chest, his entire body alight with conflicting urges, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Zora had always been professional, calm, collected. But now, all he could see was a creature caught between her own desires and her sense of duty. She was a slave to her biology, her mind clouded by an uncontrollable need. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was supposed to clean. That was the deal. This wasn't a romantic encounter. It wasn't supposed to cross that line. But Ethan couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward her, the undeniable attraction that surged through him like a wave crashing against the shore. It wasn't just her beauty. No, it was more than that. It was the way she needed him, the way her struggle seemed to mirror his own. I don't know what to do, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. His hands shook as he took a step back, his mind spinning as the gravity of the situation settled over him. Zora, you're not yourself right now. Zora's eyes flickered with something, anger, frustration, a deep, painful awareness that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. I know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I know, Ethan, but I can't stop it. I never asked for this to happen. You don't know what it's like to fight against something like this, to have no control over your own body. I need you. She stepped closer again, and this time Ethan didn't move. His body betrayed him, his feet rooted to the floor, his breath shallow. There was something in her eyes that made him feel like he was the one who needed to make a decision, like he was the one who had to save them both from the overwhelming tension. The room seemed to grow smaller, suffocating. Ethan could feel the heat rising between them, a magnetic force that drew him closer despite every rational thought in his mind telling him to turn away. Zora's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she reached out a trembling hand, brushing against his arm. Ethan, please, she said again, her voice barely audible, thick with a mixture of pleading and something darker, something primal. I don't know what will happen if we don't finish this. If I don't have you now, I may lose myself. I may never come back to who I was. Her words stung. It was a rawness in her voice, the desperation that shone through despite her best efforts to maintain composure. Ethan wanted to scream, to tell her to stop, to send her away and get help, but his body betrayed him. His emotions torn between compassion and desire, between fear and an impossible, uncontrollable longing. But then, a cold realization hit him. This wasn't just about a biological cycle anymore. Zora wasn't just an alien caught in her mating phase. She was a person, a living being who was struggling to maintain control. and he was the one she had trusted to help her through it. He was the one she had reached out to. This wasn't about sex or attraction. This was about something deeper. Zora was asking for help in the only way she knew how. And, in a way, so was Ethan. She had no one else to turn to. No one who understood her. No one but him. "Zora," Ethan said again, his voice breaking as he took a slow, cautious step toward her. His heart raced. But his mind had finally cleared, and with that clarity came a sense of resolve. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm not going to let you lose yourself." Zora's eyes flickered with surprise, her body stiffening as though she had expected him to reject her, to push her away. But Ethan's hand reached out, gently cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing over her smooth, glowing skin. She shivered at the contact, and for the first time since she had arrived, her breath steadied. "You're not alone," Ethan said again, his voice filled with more certainty than he felt. "We'll figure this out together." For a long moment, there was silence. Zora's eyes softened, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was a fragile piece, one that could shatter in an instant, but it was enough for now. Ethan had made his choice. He wouldn't walk away from her. He wouldn't let her face this alone. And, in a way, that was all they both needed, to be seen, to be understood, in a world where they were both struggling to find their place. The line between duty, desire, and survival had blurred, and neither of them knew where it would lead. But for now, they would face it together. The tension between them slowly began to shift, though it was far from gone. It was as if the room itself had exhaled, releasing some of the pressure that had built up between Ethan and Zora. Still, neither of them moved for a long time. Zora's eyes were locked onto his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her breath had slowed, the frantic urgency that had once marked her every movement now tempered by his presence. Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He wasn't sure how long they stood there like that, frozen, barely breathing. The weight of the situation still hung over them like a dark cloud. But somehow, they both knew that something important had shifted in the space between them. Ethan had made a choice, but that didn't mean everything was suddenly fine. There were still questions, still the overwhelming uncertainty of what would happen next. "Ethan," Zora whispered, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer now, more like the Zora he knew, but there was still a slight tremor to it, a reminder of the internal battle she had fought and was still fighting. "I'm sorry. I never meant to make you uncomfortable. I never meant to make you feel like I was demanding this from you." Ethan took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and gently cupped her face in his hands. Her skin felt warm against his palms, the pulse of her life force beneath the surface a reminder of just how fragile this moment was. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from something else, something deeper. "Zora, it's okay," he said, his voice steady but low. "You don't have to apologize. I understand now. It's not your fault. And I don't want you to feel like you have to go through this alone anymore." Her eyes softened, and the faintest hint of a tear glistened at the corner of her eye. She leaned into his touch, her entire body visibly relaxing under his gentle hands. For the first time in what felt like ages, Zora seemed to let go of the battle inside herself, if only for a moment. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here," she murmured, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know if I could have kept control, not with what's happening inside me." Ethan's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. He could feel her fear, her overwhelming sense of helplessness. Zora wasn't just a maid, an alien in a strange cycle. She was a person, struggling against something far beyond her control. And in that moment, as he held her close, he realized just how much he had underestimated the depth of her own feelings. She wasn't just another visitor from an alien world. She was someone who had trusted him, who had come to him for understanding. And he had almost let that trust slip through his fingers. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," Ethan said again, his voice more certain this time. "Whatever's happening, I'm here. I'll be here for you, Zora. You don't have to handle it on your own." Zora let out a slow, shaky breath, her body visibly relaxing as she allowed herself to trust him more fully. For a moment, the space between them seemed to stretch, as if they were both trying to figure out what came next. Ethan didn't know what that would be. He didn't know how they could move forward after everything that had happened, after confusion, the tension, the instincts that had taken over. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to walk away. Zora slowly pulled back, her eyes meeting his once more. The intensity in her gaze had softened, but there was still something raw there, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and perhaps even fear. "I don't know what happens now," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can just go back to the way things were. I don't know if I can control myself again, not after what happened." Ethan shook his head gently, his thumbs brushing along her cheeks. "I don't expect things to go back to normal. We're not going to just pretend like none of this happened." He paused, searching for the right words. "But I think we can figure it out together, one step at a time, no matter how messy it gets." Zora studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read him, to understand whether he truly meant what he said. Ethan knew he couldn't erase the complexity of what had just happened between them, nor could he predict what the future would hold, but he could offer her something: his presence, his understanding, and a willingness to help her navigate this strange, unfamiliar terrain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zora's lips curved into the smallest, most tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for Ethan to feel like he wasn't alone in this moment, like he hadn't made the wrong choice after all. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly, her voice a little steadier than before. "Thank you for being here, for understanding." Ethan gave her a small, reassuring smile in return. "It's the least I can do. You're not alone in this." For a long while, neither of them spoke, but the silence between them wasn't filled with tension anymore. Instead, it was a quiet understanding, a moment of shared vulnerability that neither of them had expected, but that both had needed more than they realized. Ethan stepped back, giving Zora some space. He watched as she turned back to the cleaning supplies, her movements now slower, more deliberate. But there was something different about the way she moved now. The urgency was still there, still underlying everything she did, but there was no longer the frantic desperation. She was no longer alone in this fight. And as Zora began to clean again, Ethan knew that their relationship, whatever it would become, had shifted. It wasn't just about her being his maid anymore. It wasn't just about a strange alien cycle and a human trying to make sense of it all. It was about two people from two very different worlds, learning to navigate something neither of them truly understood. What came next was uncertain. The journey ahead was unknown. But for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. And that, in itself, was enough. The room had settled into a strange, fragile calm. Zora continued to work, but now there was a subtle shift in her movements. They were more controlled, less frantic, though Ethan could still see the occasional tremor in her hands as she wiped down the counter. Every now and then, she would glance at him, as if checking to see if he was still there, still watching. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but there was no longer the oppressive weight of discomfort. Instead, there was a tentative understanding, a bond, however fragile, that had formed between them. Ethan didn't know how long he'd be able to stay in this strange limbo, unsure of what was happening between them. His thoughts kept returning to the way she had looked at him when she had asked for help. It hadn't been just about the mating cycle. It had been about vulnerability, about her trust in him. She had asked him for something no one else had, something raw, something she had never shown to anyone else. And he had chosen not to turn away. As he sat on the couch, watching Zora work, his mind started to wander, drifting into thoughts he hadn't let himself entertain before. What would this look like when her cycle was over? Would things go back to normal? Would she leave his apartment and return to her usual role as a maid, or would they somehow navigate this new dynamic between them? He couldn't deny that something had shifted, not just in her, but in him, too. A connection had been forged, one that went beyond a professional relationship, one that neither of them could ignore. The question was, what would they do with it? He snapped out of his thoughts when he noticed that Zora had stopped moving again. She was standing in the center of the room, her back straight and her eyes distant. Her face was pale, and for the first time, her glow seemed a little less intense. Ethan stood, walking slowly toward her, unsure what was happening. "Zora," he called softly. She didn't immediately respond. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point, as though she were lost in thought. When she did turn toward him, her face was full of conflict. "I can feel it starting to fade," she said quietly, her voice heavy. "The cycle, it's ending. My instincts, they're less overwhelming now. But it's difficult." She took a deep breath, clearly trying to steady herself. "I don't know what comes next. I don't know what to do." Ethan felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the uncertainty that had replaced the frantic energy from earlier. Zora wasn't just an alien trapped in a biological cycle anymore. She was a person, lost, confused, and perhaps even scared. She had no idea what the future held, and Ethan couldn't blame her for that. After everything they'd been through, neither of them had any real answers. "You don't have to figure out all at once," Ethan said gently, stepping closer. "You're not alone, Zora. We'll take it one step at a time. Whatever happens next, we'll figure out together." Zora didn't speak right away, but her gaze softened, and for a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. All the confusion, the tension, the uncertainty. It was still there, but somehow it felt manageable, because, for the first time, they were both acknowledging that they had to face it together. Zora nodded slowly, though her eyes were filled with a deep, quiet sadness. "I never wanted to put you in this position, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of my biological mess. I didn't want you to be part of this at all. I never wanted you to feel like you had to help me." Ethan's heart ached at her words. He could see how much guilt weighed on her, how deeply she regretted involving him in something so personal, so chaotic. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't see, was that he didn't feel burdened. If anything, he felt grateful for the opportunity to help her, even if it meant wading through the confusion and complexity of their situation. "Zora," he said, reaching out to gently take her hand, "you didn't force me to do anything. I chose to be here. I chose to help you. You don't have to apologize for that. We both made decisions, and we both got through this together." She stared at their joined hand for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm not used to relying on others," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "But you didn't push me away. You didn't turn your back on me when I needed you. And I don't know why that means so much, but it does." Ethan smiled softly, the weight of everything that had passed between them hanging in the air like a promise. "You don't have to understand all right now, Zora," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to carry this by yourself anymore." For a long while, neither of them spoke. Zora's breath had steadied, her glow now only a faint shimmer against the soft lighting in the room. There was still uncertainty in the air, still a sense of unease about the future. But it was different now. They had shared something that couldn't be undone. It had been messy, complicated, and a little overwhelming, but in the end, it had created something real, a connection. Finally, Zora exhaled slowly and gave him a small, fragile smile. "Thank you, Ethan, for being patient, for not running away from this." Ethan gave her a reassuring look, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "There's no reason to run away. Not from you." As they stood there, the weight of their shared experience settling between them, Ethan knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Their relationship had changed, and there was no going back to the way things had been. But maybe, just maybe, this new beginning was exactly what they both needed. The cycle had ended, but their story, whatever it was just beginning. The air in the room felt different now, calmer. The storm of tension, urgency, and raw emotion that had once filled every corner had quieted. Zora stood before Ethan, her posture softer, less strained. The alien intensity that had almost overwhelmed her seemed to have faded, leaving behind only the person he had come to know. The Zora who had been professional, understanding, and yes, at times, even playful. Yet, despite the quiet that had settled between them, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much left unsaid. There were so many things they hadn't addressed. What this moment meant for their relationship, what would happen when she left, and whether they would return to the awkward dynamic of employer and maid. Would they even be able to go back to that? He glanced at her, taking in her form again, her blue skin now a softer hue, the glow in her eyes having dimmed but not disappeared entirely. Even with everything that had happened, He couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of her presence. But that beauty was now more than skin deep. She wasn't just an alien with striking features. She was someone he cared about. Zora caught his gaze and smiled, albeit weakly. "I think it's time for me to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her tone was soft but final, as if she had made some sort of decision. "I've overstayed my welcome, and I need to recalibrate. I need some time to process everything." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy at the thought of her leaving. There was a part of him that didn't want to let her go, that wanted to keep her here where he knew she was safe from the pressures of her own biology. But he knew that wasn't fair to either of them. Zora needed space, and so did he. They both needed to figure out what came next, whether they could move past what happened, or whether this would mark an unspoken end to whatever had started between them. "You're right," he said slowly. "Maybe it's best that you get some time to think about everything. But you don't have to do that alone, you know." Zora looked at him, her violet eyes searching his face. There was an unreadable expression on her face, but the faintest glimmer of warmth lingered in her gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, as though unsure of what to say next. "I've never really had anyone to talk to," she admitted, her voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "Not like this. Not like you." She seemed to search for the words, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. "It's strange, but I don't want to go back to the way things were before. I don't want to lose whatever this is, whatever we are." Ethan's heart skipped a beat at her words. For a moment, he couldn't find the right response. The air between them was thick with something deeper than just sympathy or attraction. It was a shared understanding. He had never anticipated that this would be where they ended up. But now, standing in the quiet aftermath of everything, he realized something. Maybe they had both been trying to keep a sense of normalcy, trying to hold on to the boundaries they had once shared. But those boundaries had already been blurred, and it was time to face it. He took a step closer to her, closing the distance between them just a little more. "I don't want to lose this either, Zora," he said quietly. "I think we're both in uncharted territory here. But whatever happens, we'll figure out. I'm not going anywhere." Zora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "I don't know what to do with that," she said, a quiet chuckle escaping her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "I'm not used to this vulnerability, to someone offering something without expecting anything in return." Ethan smiled softly, his thumb brushing over her hand in a gesture that was both comforting and affectionate. "I'm not asking for anything, Zora, just that we figure this out together." Zora's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. For the first time, the uncertainty in her expression seemed to lift, if only slightly. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start, a fragile, tentative beginning that both of them were willing to explore. I think I could use someone like you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Someone who doesn't judge. Someone who can help me find my way out of this." Ethan felt his heart swell at her words, and for a brief moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. He wasn't sure where they would go from here, what this strange bond between them would evolve into, but he knew he didn't want it to end. They both had questions, and neither of them had the answers. But they had time to figure it out at their own pace. "Well, I'm here," Ethan said, his voice steady, filled with quiet resolve. "And I'm not going anywhere, not now, not ever. Whatever you need, Zora, I'll be here." Zora met his gaze again, her lips curving into a soft smile, one that was full of relief, of hope. She didn't say anything more, but her hand squeezed as in a gesture of unspoken agreement. Maybe they didn't have it all figured out yet. Maybe they were still walking through a fog of uncertainty. But they were doing it together. For now, that was enough. As the evening stretched on, the two of them remained there, sharing a moment of quiet understanding. They didn't need to rush into any decisions or confront the future right away. They had time to explore what this new dynamic would mean, time to figure out how to move forward in a way that felt right. The cycle had ended, but in its place, something new had begun, something neither of them could have predicted, but something that held promise. And as they stood together, side by side, Ethan knew one thing for sure. They were no longer just two beings from different worlds. They were two people trying to make sense of the chaos around them, finding solace in the midst of uncertainty. And that, in itself, was enough. The days that followed felt different, though neither Ethan nor Zora knew exactly how to define it. There was an unspoken shift between them, an understanding that hadn't been there before. They were no longer just employer and employee, or even just two beings who had shared an unusual experience. What had happened between them, the chaotic, raw intensity of that time, had changed them both in ways neither of them fully understood yet. But it was there, lingering in the space between them, like a thread connecting them despite the distance of their vastly different worlds. Ethan found himself looking at Zora differently, not just as the alien who had cleaned his apartment, but as someone with her own complexities, her own struggles. She wasn't just some professional who came and went, who did her job and disappeared. She was someone with needs, fears, and desires. And now, it seemed, they were both in the process of discovering what they could offer each other beyond their initial awkward connection. As for Zora, it seemed as though the lingering effects of her cycle were slowly fading, leaving her to navigate a new reality. One where she wasn't ruled by her biology, but where the bonds she had started to form with Ethan were beginning to define her choices. There was still uncertainty, still an unease in her movements, but it wasn't the same desperation she had once felt. There was something more grounded in her now, something that Ethan had helped to cultivate, even if neither of them knew how. One afternoon, several days after the intensity had passed, Zora approached him with a different energy. She seemed lighter, more herself, but there was still a quiet tension in her posture as she entered the living room where Ethan sat, working on his computer. He didn't immediately look up, but he could feel her presence in the room, the change in the air. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice laced with something almost hesitant, "about what you said. About us." Ethan looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a moment, everything else in the room seemed to blur. There was that same vulnerability in her gaze, the same hesitance that had marked her actions before, but now it felt different, calmer, more certain. She had come to a decision. Or at least, she was close. "I don't know where this goes, Zora," Ethan said quietly, his voice full of the weight of their shared experiences. "But I know I don't want to end. I don't want to go back to the way things were. Not after everything we've been through. I don't know what this is, but I don't want to let it go." Zora met his gaze steadily, a quiet resolve replacing the uncertainty in her eyes. She took a deep breath and stepped closer, her blue skin glowing softly in the light. She didn't need to say anything more. Her action spoke louder than words ever could. When she reached out to gently take his hand, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an act of desperation, but of choice, of trust. "I think," Zora said softly, "that we're both on the same page. I'm still figuring things out, but I don't want to do it alone. Not anymore." And just like that, in that simple moment of connection, it became clear this wasn't a fleeting bond, something that would be washed away with time or circumstance. It was something real, something that had formed in the crucible of their shared vulnerability, their struggles, and their willingness to stand by each other despite everything. The complexity of what had happened between them hadn't broken them. It had forged something new, a foundation. "We'll figure it out," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We'll take it one step at a time. Zora, together." Her smile, though small, was enough to fill the room with warmth. There was no fear in it, no uncertainty. It was a smile of someone who had finally found a place where they didn't have to hide their true self, someone who could just be. And in that moment, Ethan knew, for all the complications of the relationship, alien, human, the mess of biology and emotion, this was where they were meant to be. Zora's grip on his hand tightened slightly, and they stood there for a moment, silently acknowledging the space they had shared, the decisions they had made, and the road ahead of them. It wouldn't be easy, and there would still be questions, but they didn't need to have everything figured out. They had each other, and in the end, that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew. They found ways to navigate the complexities of their relationship, always taking it one step at a time, learning more about each other and themselves. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments where the weight of their differences seemed too great to bear, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. Ethan didn't know where this relationship would go, He didn't know if it would last or how it would evolve. But one thing was clear. Whatever came next, they were no longer just an alien and a human who had found themselves in an impossible situation. They were two people who had chosen to see each other, truly see each other, and in doing so, had found something that neither had expected, a connection, and that, Ethan realized, was enough to carry them forward, whatever the future held.